Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Lee Badgett, who is a professor of economics and co-director of the Center for Employment Equity at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She is also a Williams Distinguished Scholar at UCLA's Williams Institute. Her research focuses on economic inequality for LGBT people, including wage gaps, employment discrimination, and poverty, and on the global cost of homophobia and transphobia. Her latest book is The Economic Case for LGBT Equality: Why Fair and Equal Treatment Benefits Us All. Welcome, Lee.
Thanks, Gil. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah, I want to start with the economic case for LGBT inclusion, and that is really the topic of your latest book. But I want to sort of look at the micro problem first. I know that you focused on countrywide issues. When I went to business school, now in prehistoric times, we were taught that our job is to maximize shareholder value. When I went to work, I quickly found out that it's not something that the managers of the firm typically worry about. Their objective function is much simpler, and it includes maximizing self-importance and self-worth. But if this principal agent problem did not exist in firms, anything other than inclusion of all will be irrational. Economists win Nobel Prizes proving, I would say, such commonsensical ideas, but business schools do not teach it, even now, for unknown reasons. So the managers of firms or the consultants they hire or the investment bankers who make deals for them may not have a good sense of how value is created in the firm. So will making an economic case for inclusion have any practical effects within firms?
I think it can, but I think it doesn't happen on its own. And I think that's kind of what you're saying. I mean, economists talk at this very high abstract level about incentives to do the thing that will maximize shareholder value or whatever it is. And exactly what you just said is important to take into account, that there are people at the other end of these theories, and what they do might be guided by theories, but it might be that you need a lot of people to fill in the gap, right, between the theory and the practice. And I think, although I am an economist, I like to think of myself as also a practical person with some knowledge about institutions and the real world. And what we know is a lot of times employers only change their policies when their employees come to them and say, hey, let's talk. We think we're being treated unfairly. And you may not realize it, but let's tell you kind of what's going on. So this is actually how a lot of change took place in corporate America related to LGBT people and LGBT rights. This has been going on for decades now. And in many ways, corporations were ahead of the game in the US, ahead of policymakers. But anyway, so they talked to their employees, and what their employees said was, we think it's the right thing to do to treat us the same way. So if you give healthcare benefits to spouses of employees, then you should give them to our same-sex partners, even back when same-sex couples couldn't get married, especially then, in fact. Yeah. And they said, that's treating us equally. But they also said, and here's why it's in your interest to do this, is because if one of your competitors for highly skilled labor offers those benefits, then you're going to lose people. They're not going to want to come work for you. They're going to leave their jobs. They're going to take the skills that they've gained, and they're going to go work for your competitors. And you don't want that to happen. If you don't do this, then you've got employees who are going to be sitting in the office doing their jobs, but also maybe worrying about how their spouses or their partner's healthcare is going to get paid for, how their kids' healthcare is going to get paid for. That's not good for their productivity. So you don't want them to be unproductive. And those kinds of arguments were the sorts of things that resonated with employers. The other kind of thing that people would argue is, gay people buy things. They buy services, financial services. They buy cars, they buy houses, and you don't want to alienate a potentially important and lucrative part of your market. So there were lots of reasons that were mobilized by, the LGBT people in those workplaces to make that argument. And as it turned out, the employers often bought those arguments. I mean, they actually could see the logic to these arguments. So this is something that's been happening at the corporate level for a long time, making those kinds of arguments. And I don't know if you follow, the Supreme Court cases around marriage and some of the other non-discrimination cases, the one that came out most recently. But employers were filing friend of the court briefs in those cases, making exactly these same kinds of arguments, saying, yeah, we think that everybody should be able to come to work without fear of discrimination, and we try to create those kinds of workplaces. And so, we think that we should have federal laws protecting those workers from discrimination. That's the good thing to do. It's good for businesses like ours. Same thing for same-sex marriage. Many hundreds of employers signed these briefs saying to the Supreme Court, yeah, we want to treat our employers fairly, but we cannot. You're also holding us back. We can't treat them in the same way that we do different sex couples when we might want to transfer them to a state where they are not allowed to marry and their marriage won't be recognized, or when they pay more in taxes for healthcare benefits for their partners. That's bad for our business too.
So when employers get it. So, employees complain, we have protests. When employers get it, are they getting it because they want to minimize costs, or are they getting it to maximize the value of the firm? The reason I ask is, there is, you can observe a lot of these things. For example, we put the board between C-level execs and shareholders. If you go into a board meeting and you find 16 clones who look exactly like you, it should generally tell you there is something wrong. But I recently heard a large airline CEO saying, hey, I have to pay attention to it. And if you haven't paid attention to it now, and you just found out, this is a problem, I wonder it's a cost minimization activity rather than, really kind of tackling the problem. What do you think?
Well, I think that two things happen when employees come in and make this case to their employers. In one aspect of it is certainly the cost minimization, the kind of wanting to do the thing that's good for the business. But a lot of employers often want to do the right thing, and when they meet people and they hear their employees talk about their lives, and and develop some kind of understanding of the challenges that LGBT people face, a lot of them seem to have seem to get it, and they seem to understand that it's also kind of the morally right thing to do, that there's larger human costs to dignity and to people feeling fully included, not just in the workplace, but just in general. And they do care about those things. And
Yeah.
studies that have where CEOs have been interviewed where that clearly makes a difference. There have been cases where the CEOs may have kids who turn out to be LGBT, and they're sort of, they change how they see these issues. So I think it's really kind of, it's really sort of both in this particular case. The right thing to do on a moral level for human rights, on a human rights level, is the right thing to do from a business perspective as well. So that should make it easier, actually, I think, for employers to be willing to go along with this. And it does seem like that's what's happened, because many firms have changed their policies without being required to do so.
Right. Yeah, so I want to jump into the book. In the book, you have looked at sort of the macro effects of this, right? Countrywide effects. When you have certain rights, you looked at GDP growth, and things like that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, because I think, all the things that we've talked about so far are really kind of at that micro level. But one of the tests of the idea that there's an economic case for equality is to look at it at this larger level. So there's a couple of different ways to do it. I mean, one way is to compare countries and to look at the countries that are that have more supportive laws, more supportive people, more supportive of LGBT people in them, and see how well they do economically compared to the countries that are not so supportive. So I've done this in a number of different ways, using both laws as a measure of support and also public opinion. And then I've looked at how that affects, the variation of GDP, as you just mentioned, but also taking into account the other things that matter for GDP. So things that aren't LGBT related, but are about, the stock of human capital, the stock of physical capital, the workforce, other kinds of things that are specific to countries. And what we have found very consistently is that the companies that have better policies or more accepting people have higher levels of GDP. So there is this correlation, clearly a positive correlation between, having being more equal for LGBT people and having stronger economies. So that's kind of that's the one way to look at it at the macro level.
Yeah.
The other way that I've done it, I'll just say kind of quickly, is to take all those micro pieces, looking at what happens to people in their workplaces and what the cost of discrimination might be. Taking into account some of the other costs to societies when there's exclusion of LGBT people with regard to health, for example. So looking at the higher rates of suicidality or depression or HIV or violence in some countries, and thinking about how much lower those costs would be if there were more acceptance. And so when you take those and try to cost them out, basically. Yeah. What you find is that it adds up to quite a bit. LGBT people are not a huge part of our population, but in the cases that I have done it in India and in the Philippines, and I know others who've done similar kinds of calculations in Kenya and in South Africa, what you find is it adds up. So about kind of the overlap of all those different estimates, it's about 1% of GDP. So that's a much more of a kind of a causal effect. You're sort of saying, here's what happens to LGBT people, and here's how that adds up to the cost to the economy. So both looking at it that way and looking at it across countries, you can see in a really tangible way what the cost might be.
Right. Yeah, I sometimes wonder, Ali, I want to get your perspective on this. Is inclusion an attribute of how advanced a society is? And if so, it would be correlated with a lot of different things, including happiness and potentially economics as well. And, if you sort of rewind time, 50,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens started, we had no inclusion. We had clans, who did not admit people from other clans. And we progressively changed that over time. So we have increasing inclusion. In that context, is inclusion really an attribute of how advanced a society might be?
Well, I think that's a tricky question. I mean, if you think about advancement as, having stronger economies, or other things that we think would be good for good outcomes like happiness or like less inequality overall, those kinds of things. I mean, I think it's likely that there are some kinds of connections there. I think that the pathways might be a little bit different, but I think it's entirely possible that will matter. I think it gets complicated though, because a lot of things are going to happen at the same time. So I'll just give you an example of that. Those macro studies where we've looked at the impact of laws on GDP, we tried to take into account some of the other things that you might think would also happen, like having more gender equality, for example. And so we did include a measure of that in some of those studies. We looked at what was the proportion of a parliament or a Congress that was where the elected officials were women, and we used that as a measure. And what we found was that actually, even after you take that into account, you still see a very strong positive effect of the LGBT laws or LGBT acceptance on GDP. So I think it looks like it's possible that it has a very independent sort of effect, but it's also probably as we would say in economics, the causation is kind of going in both directions, because when economies are doing better, it may be that those societies are more open to human rights. And there's a whole theory about this in political science called the post-materialist hypothesis. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not. Go ahead. Yeah.
It's an interesting idea because the argument is, as economies grow and get stronger, people don't have to worry quite so much just about basic subsistence. And so that opens up the possibilities of, loosening up existing traditions. So societies might become more secular, or they might rely less on kind of a traditional authority as the structure that kind of holds everything together. And there might be more room for thinking about individual rights just in general. And so you might also have more time to spend on organizing social movements. There might be more openness to them. So you can also imagine that economies that are stronger, growing faster, having higher levels of per capita GDP are also going to be places where LGBT people will be more accepted. So it's a little bit hard to know, how much of the correlation that we see kind of comes from that direction.
Right.
Just to be totally honest about it, and that's going to take more research to sort that out. But at the same time, I do point back to those models that have built up from the differences, from the challenges that we see for LGBT people, and show how those are costly, the cost of discrimination, the cost of health disparities. So I think, that's it's important to kind of think about it both from the macro and the micro at the same time.
Yeah.
I know that's unusual for economists, but it's I think that's the way you have to think about it to see what these connections are.
Right. Have you looked at longitudinally, this type of effect anywhere?
Yeah, well, that's how we did these cross-country studies. We did have data over time, so. Sometimes depending on the group of countries that we were studying. But for the largest study, we went back to the 1960s. So we had data on laws going back to the 60s. And so we could control for what we call country fixed effects. We could say, basically let's look inside the countries
right.
And hold constant what those, the specific characteristics of countries might be. And then and see how it varies, how GDP varies with acceptance or better laws, and we still see that that positive effect over time. And, I'm hoping that sometime in the future we'll have the ability, the kind of data that we'll need to, to look at changes in laws and to see if that's, if they happen first, and then we see changes in GDP. But we haven't had a chance to do that yet.
Yeah, I know that you looked at some data from India too. I'm sort of curious about it because it's a nice experiment. Post-independence, about 70 years ago, it was set up sort of like a secular country. And I don't know if data shows anything. There are some trends of late that it may not be, right? So we would generally expect a society to get better over time. So have you seen any trends that goes the other way?
We definitely see trends for many countries where both acceptance is going up and where the number of laws, supportive laws that have passed is going up. India is a good example. Just a few years ago, they didn't have very many of the basic kinds of laws that we've used as measures of inclusion. But things are changing very rapidly. Just a couple of years ago, the Indian Supreme Court struck down laws that criminalize homosexuality.
Yeah.
A few years before that, they took a very strong stand and said transgender people must be treated equally and fairly, and they have to have the opportunity to live their lives, and they're treated as like a special caste, a special group as well with regard to other policies. And there are discussions about non-discrimination laws. There are discussions, many corporations are now being much more inclusive of LGBT people in India. So there's a lot of change happening in those countries. So India is really one of those countries that's in the category of seeing very clear improvements. However, there are other countries that are not seeing such great improvements. I mean, we can see, regression in countries like Uganda and Nigeria that have passed laws that make it even harder, that sort of super criminalize homosexuality and make it harder for allies to speak out in favor of LGBT people, or to have organizations in support of LGBT rights. We see the same thing in Russia. We see this and we even see some backlash here in the United States when some of the things that have been in place for several years have been dismantled by the current administration. So, so there's always a little tension, but then there's some countries that are really kind of clearly sort of regressing in terms of acceptance. I think in Poland, the president who was just reelected has been a strong opponent of LGBT people and LGBT rights. So there are many challenges in lots of different parts of the world.
Yeah, you looked at some survey data too, right? So asking people how open they are, and there is significant difference between countries there. And, I sometimes wonder, laws are one thing, but the more important thing I would imagine from a societal perspective is how people feel. So do you see any correlations between how people feel and how countries enacted laws in this area?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's some political scientists who've looked at that, and they do see that that attitudes matter. They're positively the more accepting people are, the more supportive laws tend to be. That is not always a one-to-one correspondence. I mean, in the United States, for example, we've had public opinion has been way ahead on some issues like non-discrimination policies, way ahead of policy, whereas it took a long time for kind of opinion about marriage equality to catch up with the law. But so there is that correlation. I think, what was I going to say about that? I think if you're thinking though about how to really define inclusion, both of those kind of give LGBT people some space to operate in. And so they're both important. What we still don't have though is a lot of good data on what this looks like from the LGBT perspective. So how well are LGBT people doing in all these different countries Are they more likely to be poor than other people? Are their incomes lower than they should be given their skills and experience? How's their health? Those kinds of things are really hard to measure still. And there's actually been an interesting effort that the UN Development Program and the World Bank have been working on to create a global index. They call it the LGBTI Inclusion Index.
Yeah.
That extra I in LGBT stands for intersex people. So they are advocating for countries to start collecting better data on LGBT people so that we can actually make those kinds of comparisons, in terms of people's lived experience, not just, kind of what the law might allow, but you might still have to fight for and contest. And it's not just about public acceptance, but what people really feel in their day-to-day lives. So I think, I'm hopeful that over time we'll have more and more good data that we can really dig into.
Yeah. And you looked at wage gaps specifically, right? Was that by country or?
We have some data on wage gaps from several countries. It's mostly the United States, it's Australia, it's Western European countries. We're starting to get some data from some Latin American countries, and actually, it's a really interesting kind of pattern. I mean, so for gay and bisexual men, we actually see that they earn less than straight men do. And it's, on average across the countries that have been studied, it's about 11% less. So that's people who have the same education, same kinds of jobs, same level of experience. They are the same in all the ways that should matter, except that some are gay and bisexual. So that wage gap is something that's pretty common across countries. When you look at women, you get a somewhat different picture. So lesbian and bisexual women, and a lot of these surveys that have been done, it looks like they actually earn more than heterosexual women do. So that's pretty interesting. But I think what that reflects is that that the lesbians are less likely to be tied to families or husbands. They may be able to, or they may need to actually invest more in their own skills and knowledge so that they do well in the labor force, because they are not going to have a man's income to count on. They're a little bit less likely to have kids, but there's still lots of them do have kids. But even so, we see that they earn a little bit more, something around, on average, about 9% more than the heterosexual women do. So, so for the gay men, I would argue that wage gap is kind of a measure of their productivity loss, right? Of being steered into jobs that they're either overqualified for or not getting jobs that they are qualified for. And for the women, it's really about, in countries like the ones that have been studied, which are pretty open, relatively open for lesbians and gay men, LGBT people generally, they are, the lesbian and bisexual women are actually sort of more productive than the heterosexual women are. Heterosexual women in general just, I think, seem to be the group that's sort of at the bottom of the economic ladder, and especially for in places where there's racial and ethnic differences. Often women of color are there at the bottom, but the lesbian women are sort of able to overcome some of those barriers and to do better in the labor force. So we want openness so that they can do that, right? So that's kind of the challenge, I think, for economies to fully take advantage of the skills and knowledge, the creativity, the work commitment of LGBT people.
Right. Yeah. So that's very interesting. So suppose we superimpose, I would imagine LGBT wage gaps is simultaneous with gender-based wage gaps. So if we superimpose the gender-based wage gaps, will we see something like, for men, straight men earn 10 and LGBT men earns 9. And you look at women and you superimpose the gender wage gap, it's 8 and 9. So it's almost like people in the LGBT bucket, whether it's, I'm making this hypothesis to tell me if it's wrong. You don't find a lot of gender-based wage gap in the LGBT bucket. Is that possible?
Unfortunately, that's not what happens. Yeah. So there actually are differences between lesbians and gay men. Yeah. So it's, if you had to sort of like put people in order of how well they do, the heterosexual men would be at the top. Then it would be like the gay men earning about 9 cents on the, 90 cents on the dollar. And then the lesbians would be somewhere below that, but still above the heterosexual women. And in the U.S., I think the wage gap right now is about 20%. So it's the heterosexual women make about 80 cents on the dollar, and the lesbians are kind of somewhere in between that 80 and 90%.
Yeah, but in general, though, the gender wage gap will be lower in the LGBT cohort. Is it because when a firm hires LGBT, somebody from that LGBT cohort, it's already forward-looking firm. So I'm asking, is there a kind of a firm-wide data that might tell us how that gap is moving, both LGBT as well as gender?
Yeah, great question. I wish we had that data. We don't. But I would say, I think the main reason why that gap is a little bit smaller between lesbians and gay men is just because the gay men are earning less, so they're being treated, more like women are in that sense, because they're ending up with lower earnings, and the women are, doing a bit better because they work more hours, they work more of the year, and they may have more experience than the heterosexual women do. So it's kind of a combination of both of those things. But for lesbians, they're facing both those challenges. I mean, they're facing everything that women face, but then they were also potentially, facing discrimination because of being lesbians. There's a whole other set of studies that are really interesting. They're kind of experiments. We don't get to do experiments very often in economics, but we're doing them more and more. And you can take two resumes and that are pretty much identical in terms of people's experience, where they live, where they went to school. And if you label one of them in some way as being probably somebody who's LGBT, like saying I was in the LGBT, my college LGBT group, and you don't have that on the other resume, and you send both of them out there, both those hypothetical people, to apply for jobs, what we find is that the gay or the lesbian applicant actually is much less likely to get invited for an interview than the one that's not labeled as LGBT. So let's call that the heterosexual person. So even though lesbians kind of look like they're doing better, they're still likely to experience discrimination if they're really open. So it's not clear that advantage is something you can really take advantage of. So you can't, like, should you go out and put that on your resume before you apply for a job? Hey, I'm a lesbian. I'm not gonna, not going to fulfill all your gender expectations. No, that's probably not a good idea, because we know that there is this other kind of discrimination.
Yeah. I know that you have been looking at this historically also, Lee. So, except for the unusual regime that we are in today, it sounds like you are generally optimistic that things are improving in the U.S. context.
Yeah, I mean, I like being an optimist. Definitely, if you take the long view, you can see positive changes, I think. I think the history of marriage equality is a great example in the U.S., where it was just kind of unimaginable 30 years ago. And if you would ask people and do surveys, hardly anyone in the public would be in favor of marriage equality. I think in the mid-90s, it was like 1 in 4 people in the US were in favor. And then now, we not only have national marriage equality, but 2/3 of people in the United States agree that marriage equality is a good thing. So people's minds have changed. Our policies have changed. LGBT people's ability to live their lives has changed and has improved. I think, there's still a lot of tension because it doesn't help everybody. There's certainly a lot of ways in which some of the things that have changed for the better are going to help more middle-class LGBT people more. I've been doing other research that shows that poverty is very common in the LGBT community, especially for transgender people, for example. And it's not clear that we figured out a good way to even understand what's going on there, and much less to actually develop policies that are going to improve people's lives at the very lowest end of the income distribution. So there's still a lot of work left to do, even though I like to see the positive side of things that have changed over the longer haul.
Right. Yeah. So in conclusion, Lee, if you look forward 5 years, what do you realistically think? I'm talking the U.S. context now. What do you realistically think we will be at 5 years from now? And more importantly, what do you think are the specific sort of policy and firm-wide or firm level, I should say, actions that you anticipate happening in those 5 years?
Okay, well, let's start with the firm side because I feel more confident about predictions there. I think that the genuine change that's happened in a lot of companies will continue. I think we're seeing companies still evolving in terms of what that means. I mean, it doesn't just mean non-discrimination policies and partner benefits anymore. Now it means, what kind of training are you giving your employees about LGBT issues? How are you managing transgender people's transitions in the workplace? What are you doing when there's anti-LGBT legislation proposed where you operate? And so companies, for example, many more companies are taking public stands, not just in favor of positive laws, but against the negative ones. We're seeing companies, I've been doing some case studies of IBM, and they were a pioneer in something that they call self-ID, that letting employees tell the company, their employer, that they do identify as LGBT. That way, that's good for LGBT workers because they can find each other. The employer can help them find each other. It's good for the employer because if they want to make sure they have a diverse, pool for leadership development, for example, that they'll be able to know if they're tapping into LGBT people, they can invite people in. So those kinds of changes, I think, are things that firms are going to continue in the future. Looking more broadly, I think it's a challenge. I mean, I think there are the most recent Supreme Court decision that said that LGBT people are covered by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 against discrimination by employers is really important. They said, yes, sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination are basically forms of sex discrimination. So that's already illegal. So that's all very positive, but there's still lots of other aspects of discrimination that are not prevented by that. So I think there's a lot of room for legislation at the federal level to deal with credit and housing and public accommodations. Those are all going to be important issues to deal with. There are, ongoing challenges around transgender people in the military, about how federal policy will treat LGBT people's issues in every possible context, from health to child welfare policies. So there's a lot that's at stake, that's still in play. Now, what direction will that go? I mean, there's two very plausible scenarios that are completely the opposite, going in the opposite direction, I think, and it's all going to depend a lot on what happens in the election in the fall, I think. If we're going to have, a continuation of the current administration, then, there will be many battles. There will be many continued battles over these issues. I think, there's another candidate whose policies are going to be much more amenable to LGBT people's rights and codifying those rights, supporting administrative efforts as well as legislative and judicial efforts to ensure those rights are enforced. So it's very hard to predict that. I guess you could just kind of fill in the blank of what you think is going to happen in November and sort of guess which path I think we're likely to go. Yeah. So I guess the thing is, I guess the summary is there's some things that I feel like there's a lot of momentum, on the workplace side. It's a lot less clear kind of on the policy side.
Yeah. I'm optimistic because of, I think, two different things. One is the power of social media. I think, it's going to have a huge impact on how policies are going to be made in the future, I would imagine. And then, if you have a situation where the average age of policymakers is 75, and they're making policies for the 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds, that's not a sustainable situation. And we already see signs that that's going to change. And so social media coupled with policymakers who are more in tune and touch with the general population could substantially remove all these complications, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. Over the longer haul, I think that there has been huge. The generational change will definitely benefit LGBT people. I don't think there's any question about that. I would agree.
Yeah. This has been great, Lee. Thanks so much for the time that you spent with me. And
thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.